Well, good evening and welcome to the Sheldon Museum of Art and tonight's Peter J. Hoagland lecture here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My name is Ronnie Green and I have the pleasure of serving as the Chancellor here at the University, and it's great to see such a wonderful crowd here tonight to hear an important discussion with our invited lecturer and guests. I first want to just recognize a few people who are with us for the lecture. You might know that this is a rotating lecture, 1 year at UNO, the next year at UNL. So we're pleased to have joining us here tonight Mayor Chris Beitler, Mayor of Lincoln. Chris, welcome you and Judy. Very pleased to have you here tonight. Senator Adam Moorfeld from here in Lincoln in our state legislature. Very pleased to have representatives of the Hoagland family. And I'd please ask you to join me in welcoming Barbara, the wife of Peter J. Hoagland, and their son, one of their, I think, 5 children, Barbara. Their son, David, who joins us from Washington, D.C. tonight. So please welcome the Hoagland family. We have a number of our leaders from the University of Nebraska here tonight with us as well, and I'll just mention a few of them. Our former Chancellor, Harvey Perlman. Harvey, very good to see you here tonight. Don D. Plowman, our Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Academic Officer. Sonia Feigenbaum, who is our lead for our international programs, our Senior International Officer here at the University. Joe Francisco, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Joe is sitting right up here. Beth Tice Morse, Associate Dean of the College and formerly Chair of the Political Science Department here. Maria Marin, I think I saw Maria come in, Dean of the College of Journalism and Mass Communications. Very pleased that David Booker, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences from our sister campus at the University of Nebraska-Omaha, is here tonight. And Kevin Smith, our Chair of the Political Science Department, who you'll hear from here in just a few moments. So please join me in welcoming all of these university leaders. This is one of many things that is supported philanthropically for our university, and you're going to meet in just a few moments the benefactor of this lecture series, who's brought it to us in honor of his friend and colleague Peter J. Hoagland. That's done through our University of Nebraska Foundation. And I'd also like to recognize tonight our CEO of the foundation, Brian Hastings, who's with us tonight, and his wife Sharon. So join me in welcoming Brian. Now, I'd like, Jim, for you to come ahead and come up while I say a few things about you. I mentioned that this is from the generosity of the support of Jim and his wife, Patsy Crowns, who have been benefactors for the university in a variety of ways. This is one of the many ways that they have supported Jim's alma mater. He is a graduate of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, as somewhere back in the few decades ago, 70s. And then went on to law school at Creighton here in the state, and has developed quite a reputation, as you know, for being a strategist around politics and around the political process in our country. And Jim had the pleasure of working with Mr. Hoagland, with Congressman Hoagland, when he served the great state of Nebraska after having been a state senator here in our unicameral, serving the 2nd District of the state of Nebraska in the U.S. Congress. And when Mr. Hoagland unfortunately passed away, Jim felt very strongly that his legacy deserved a place in our academy to think about current issues and important issues of our time. And as you know, he has brought to us leaders from across the spectrum in politics to come to our campus, to come to UNO, and to give this lecture over the last few years. And tonight we're in for another treat, listening to Jeff come back to Nebraska again and share his thoughts with us. I'd like you to join me in welcoming Jim, his wife Patsy, and Patsy's son Stuart from Edinburgh, Scotland, who is with us tonight. Jim Crowns.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Green, and I want to thank the Nebraska Foundation, especially Joy and Amy. I don't know where you guys are, maybe in the back. They kind of led a team of about 20, 30, 40, 50 people, I don't know. A lot of people who make this lecture special, and Patsy and I really appreciate it more than we can say. I also want to thank Kevin Smith, the chair of the Political Science Department, and Joe Francisco at Arts and Sciences for hosting us tonight. The topic of tonight's lecture is the First Amendment to our Constitution, and specifically freedom of the press. And we've got very fortunate tonight to have two speakers for the 7th Hoagland lecture. Jeff Zeleny, a UNL grad and now CNN's White House correspondent. Jeff covered the Trump campaign, the Sanders campaign, I think both Obama campaigns. So he's a pro, and we're all very proud of him, and thank you, Jeff, for coming tonight to speak to us. We also have Professor Mike Fenner from Creighton Law School. Mike is going to speak to us first. He's going to talk to us about the history of the First Amendment, and Jeff then will tell us about exercising the First Amendment every day on CNN. Mike has a busy schedule, and Jeff has been a little busy lately covering the White House. I guess there are no slow news days anymore, right, Jeff? It's just breaking news every day. So, but it's my pleasure to introduce Mike Fenner. But before I do this, every year that we had a lecture, I want to spend a few minutes telling you about my friend Peter Hoagland, who I actually miss more than ever. For those who didn't know him, Peter was born in Omaha. He went to Stanford undergrad and Yale Law School. And after working as a Washington, D.C. public defender and serving in the Army, Peter met Barbara in D.C., and they returned to Omaha where Peter practiced law and then decided to run for office while at the same time having 5 kids. So there was a lot going on. Peter was elected to the legislature in 1978 and 1988, so he served 2 terms, and he was elected to the 6th District of Omaha, which was kind of right in the middle of town. Peter had 2 unique qualities, in my view, that this lecture series honors. First is integrity. Simply put, Peter was the most honest person I've ever met, and he had high ethical standards. Second, he had a love for learning issues in detail, and he worked in a bipartisan way to get things done in Congress and the state legislature. He was very effective. In the state legislature, he was a big supporter of the university. He helped pass campaign finance reform. He tightened penalties for drunk driving, and he tried to stop groundwater pollution here in Nebraska. He got elected to Congress in 1988, and I was proud to be his chief of staff his freshman year. He worked to strengthen our financial institutions. That was during the savings and loan crisis. He supported common sense gun safety laws, and oh, how we need them now. He supported health care reform, and he always stood up for working men and women in Congress. I know in this day and age people are very cynical about politics and Congress, and I can't blame them. But Peter was exactly the kind of person that we need today. And I hope there are students who are down this section. I hope the whole purpose of this lecture is to inspire some of you to seek a career in public service. We need you. We need good people to serve. We need you to not be cynical and follow in the footsteps of people who have high ethical standards, who learn the issues, and who work in a bipartisan way to get things done. Our first speaker tonight, Mike Fenner, was a very close friend of Peter Hoagland's and neighbor, and we're so delighted to have him here tonight. Mike is a professor of law at Creighton University. He's been there for a lot of years, where he's taught constitutional law. And I had him for evidence many years ago. He was kind of a tough grader, Mike. Mike is widely recognized as an expert in both of these fields. And in addition to teaching, Mike has practiced law. He's lectured and written many articles about the Constitution, won many awards, served as president of the Nebraska Bar Association, and that, my friends, is not fake news, just so you know. And when Peter Hoagland ran for office, Mike was as dependable a yard sign captain as I know of, and was a great friend. So please welcome my friend, Professor Mike Fenner.
Well, hello, everybody. Jim, thank you for everything you've done to create this lecture series. If this is the first time you've ever attended, or even if you've been to one or two others, take a look at the list of people who Jim has brought to these lectures. It is really impressive. It's just a lot of terrific people. But I don't have much time, so I'm not going to start naming them. But I'm really honored to be here tonight because Peter was such a great friend of mine, and I'm happy to see that Chris Beitler is here because he was a great friend of Peter's too. And I'm happy to be here, honored to be here tonight because Jeff is the main speaker, a man who does terrific work, and I'm honored because Barbara, Peter's wife, and his son David are here. I'm just the opening act. I only have a few minutes, so I want to get right into my topic, which is the First Amendment freedom of speech clause, freedom of the press clause, excuse me. And so let me get going. And let me start with this. Our European forefathers came to this country to escape tyranny. In my few minutes at this lectern, I'm not going to talk about our tyranny when we arrived here against the people who already lived here, or our tyranny when people were brought over from another country and enslaved. I'm going to talk about one of the great gifts that the Constitution has given us. And this gift comes in 4 parts. And the first 3 are these. Remember, we came here to escape tyranny. And the first 3 parts of this are the founders' notion that one of the best ways to escape tyranny was to divide the power. And so they divided the power among 3 relatively co-equal, I'll get back to that, but relatively co-equal branches of the government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. So, you know, when the legislative branch can get its act together and actually do things, it's a co-equal branch. But here's the hidden secret. There is what I think of as the 4th branch of government, and that is the men and the women who wrote the Bill of Rights. They knew that we needed one more thing, not just the diffusion of power among the 3 branches. We needed free speech, and we needed a free press. But we can't really have free speech without a free press. I grew up in St. Joseph, Missouri, and in the 60s. And how would someone in St. Joe in the 60s have known how to talk about the civil rights movement if we hadn't had the pictures and the film, if we hadn't seen the clubbing of peaceful demonstrators, if we hadn't seen the police dogs that were straining at their leashes to get at the peaceful demonstrators, if we hadn't seen the students pulled off of the lunch counter at the Woolworths and beaten to a bloody pulp by the Caucasians in the room who were so angry that they dared to try to sit at that lunch counter. We have the right to freedom of speech, but it's very much dependent on the rights of a free press? How could we ever have intelligently discussed the war in Vietnam back in St. Joe in the 60s if we hadn't seen the photos of the carnage and the atrocities, if we hadn't seen all the blood and treasure that was being sacrificed in this war? A war that the President supported, that the Congress supported, and that the United States Supreme Court tried very hard and very successfully to stay out of. And this blood and treasure was sacrificed by president after president who told us that we were winning. And Democrat and Republican presidents told us that we were winning. They told us it was going well. They told us there was light at the end of the tunnel. Well, it was the press that showed us that it wasn't going well. We weren't winning, and there wasn't any light at the end of the tunnel. It was a losing cause. It was men and women like Jeff Zeleny who told us the truth when our government wasn't telling us the truth. James Madison wrote the first draft of the Free Press Clause, and he said this in his first draft: "The freedom of the press, as one of the great bulwarks of liberty, should be inviolable. That is to say, it should be indestructible, sacrosanct, untouchable, hallowed, sacred." And I thank Mr. Roget for explaining to me what that meant. If you back up about 30 years before James Madison wrote, William Blackstone was an Englishman, and he was a famous lawyer and a famous judge in England, and he wrote the definitive work on English law. And in that work, he said this: "The liberty of the press is indeed essential to the nature of a free state." And recently, over 250 years later, Senator John McCain expanded on that. He said, "This is how dictators get started. They call the press the enemy, they call reporters liars, they call the media dishonest and the news fake. And they do that because they know that the press is what is standing in the way of them living their dream as wannabe dictators. The press is their greatest enemy." It was the press that discovered that President Nixon was a co-conspirator in the burglary of the Democratic National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. And I'm not saying that Richard Nixon wanted to be a dictator. What I am saying is this: we stop those endings by stopping the beginnings. And to do that, we need a press. And I'm going to take a second pass at this word. To do that, we need a press that is inviolable. The press is often called the fourth branch of the United States government, not by our president, of course. He calls them dishonest purveyors of fake news and enemies of the people. He says this: "They always bring up the First Amendment." Well, of course they do. That's what saves us. We came to this country to escape tyranny, and our forefathers gave us a free press to help us in this endeavor. And not to put too much pressure on you, Jeff, but you're going to have to save us. You're going to have to save us by telling us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad that you're an alum of this great university.
Thank you, Mike. My name is Kevin Smith. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department, and on behalf of the department, I'd like to say that we're delighted to be co-sponsoring this event tonight. And I have two duties to discharge tonight. One of them is to act as your interviewer. All of you should have gotten an index card on the way in. We are going to have a Q&A session a little later on. We're going to turn the tables on Jeff and make him the interviewee rather than the interviewer. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask Jeff, or a question occurs to you while he's talking, please jot it down. We've got student ambassadors who'll pick those cards up. They'll hand them to me, and then I'll interview Jeff on your behalf. My second duty, and it's a very pleasant one, is to introduce our primary speaker of the night. And I feel a little awkward in doing this because Jeff is literally someone who needs no introduction. If you're interested in politics and you follow the news, and the fact that you're here means that I presume that you do, and that you have a television or a phone or a tablet or a computer, you know who Jeff is. He's one of the most prominent journalists in our nation covering politics. So one of the things that I was doing is I was digging through Jeff's CV trying to find something about him that you don't already know. And people in Jeff's profession are often accused of being full of hot air. Well, Jeff literally is. He's a pretty good trumpet player. He was good enough to spend 2 years on the Cornhusker Marching Band. Jeff's journalism career started right here on this campus. He was the managing editor of the Daily Nebraskan. He became a professional journalist, moved down the road and worked for the Des Moines Register. From there, he went to the Chicago Tribune, where he was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory journalism. He moved up to the New York Times and covered national politics there, then on to ABC, and then on to CNN to become the senior White House correspondent. You know, just the average journalism career. As I said, Jeff truly is one of the most prominent and visible voices covering journalism today. It's amazing that he's had such a successful career in not one but two media as a journalist. It gives me great pleasure to introduce, and please join me in welcoming one of our own, Jeff Zeleny.
Well, good evening. I'm going to leave my phone right here in case there are any tweets that come in throughout the evening, and I'll bring them to you in real time. But thank you, Professor Smith. The whole backstory of playing trumpet in the marching band, it was the only way I was going to get on Memorial Stadium, being in the band, not on the team. So it was a fun run. But thank you, Chancellor Green and Professor Fenner. Those were amazing words about the history of a very important First Amendment, very important 45 words. And to the Hoagland family, to Barbara and David, and to Jim and Patsy Crounce, thank you for having me here tonight and for keeping alive the Congressman's dedication to public service. The citizens of Nebraska still benefit tremendously from the laws that Peter Hoagland was passing here in the state. And I'm not sure he would recognize Washington today, but I would like to ask him as a member of the Ways and Means Committee what he thinks about this, the tax cut bill that's coming up. But anyway, it's great to be back home and great to be back on campus here in Lincoln. I love the University of Nebraska so much I stayed here for 5.5 years, getting my undergraduate degree. It was hard to leave at the time because the Huskers were winning 3 national championships in '94, '95, and '97. So life as a student journalist here was pretty exciting and occasionally combative. Looking back, I think it was good planning and preparation for my time in Washington, particularly the combative part. Being a journalist these days requires a little bit of a thicker skin than it used to. And I'll get to that in a minute. But even though it's been more than 20 years since I left here, we had some important early fights on the First Amendment right here on campus. Coach Tom Osborne, who we revere, was often displeased with our work at the Daily Nebraskan. He would occasionally block our reporters from covering football practice. We managed to cover it anyway, once sending one of our youngest and most talented reporters, Paula Levine, who they didn't dare kick out. She was tough as nails then and now, and she's an ESPN reporter now who just published a very important book about sexual assault on college campus. But Paula was a sports reporter for a while, and she covered all that aggressively. But the fights in Washington and everywhere, it seems, are a little louder than they were back then. But as I was walking through the student union earlier today, I was thinking about those uncomfortable phone calls I took from Coach Osborne down in the basement of the editor's office of the Daily Nebraskan. But we did believe that we had the First Amendment on our side, and we believed strongly that the students and the community had the right to know what the team was doing that was gaining national attention both on and off the field. These days, the criticism that we hear rarely comes with a phone call. It usually comes in on social media, often directly from the president himself. That is not anything that we have seen before, but I've been in Washington now for 16 years, as you've heard, moving from Lincoln to Des Moines and on to Chicago. I was asked a question a lot as a kid growing up in Exeter, Nebraska, how did you get to Washington? I said, I drove east. So that was the most direct route. But the question we get the most these days is, how does the Trump presidency differ from the first and second term of the Bush administration that I covered and the first and second term of the Obama administration that I covered? The short answer, in almost every way. Above all, things move much faster now. The news cycle is at warp speed, and these days our mornings often start, as you know, with the buzzing of an iPhone. So should we keep such a close eye on the president's social media? That is a question we were asked again and again that we actually wrestled with at the beginning of this administration. Some tweets, of course, are newsworthy, some are not. But consider this message from @RealDonaldTrump at 7 o'clock this morning. Why isn't the Senate Intel Committee looking into the fake news networks in our country to see why so much of our news is just made up? Fake. Now, that's a lot to unpack in 140 characters. But you can boil it down even more. It's actually a shiny object that's intended to obscure or distract us. And in this case, it's meant to distract us from the Senate Intelligence Committee, which yesterday was giving an update on the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Now, never mind that the President of the United States is asking for a separate and equal branch of government, as Mike explained, to investigate the news media. It's not exactly what we envisioned under the First Amendment. It does make you wonder what James Madison, one of our founding fathers, who championed, quote, the right of freely examining public characters and measures, would have to say about this. But President Trump, of course, is not serious about calling for an investigation of the news media. What he's actually trying to do is undermine the trust and credibility of the press, so people aren't sure what to believe. And I'm sorry to say he's off to a pretty decent start. So how do we respond to this? How do we, as journalists, respond to this? I tell my team we do it this way, by doing our jobs, without fear or favor. So tonight, with that in mind, I can tell you that I believe the state of the First Amendment is actually very strong. From a business standpoint, starting with that, this president has been very good for journalism. The Washington Post and the New York Times are locked in an old-fashioned newspaper war, the likes of which the city has not seen in years. It's playing out in the modern age with one scoop after another. My colleagues at CNN are more than holding their own. During the first 9 months of the Trump administration, I've traveled with the president across the United States and on his first 3 foreign trips around the world. And I'll travel with him to Asia early next month. And I can tell you, it's exciting, it's exhilarating, exhausting, but most of all, it's an extraordinarily intense privilege for a Nebraska farm boy who wanted to be a reporter for as long as he can remember. But I will also say covering the White House, which offers a front row seat to history, also comes with an obligation of not simply watching, but to fairly asking questions and holding our leaders accountable. I've listened to President Trump supporters cheer him in Cedar Rapids. I've stood in the streets of Hamburg, Germany, where protesters at the G20 summit were showing the opposite reaction. And I've watched President Trump and his new BFF on the world stage, French President Emmanuel Macron, walk side by side during the Bastille Day parade in Paris. And I can tell you, after watching all of these scenes and so many more, Mr. Trump is hardly unique among presidents in drawing affection and stirring acrimony. But these days, somehow both seem so much louder and so much more intense. So a little bit behind the scenes here. Back in January, I was along for the president's first trip on Air Force One. He was flying to Philadelphia to speak to a group. It was a week after his inauguration. And he invited the press into his office on the flight back. So as we walk through the narrow hallways of Air Force One, the press sits in the very back, as they have for every president, we reach the front of the plane, and on the TV in his office, it was turned to CNN. That was one of the early signs, and we've seen many since then, that the president is indeed watching, despite his repeated assertions that he doesn't have time for television. It speaks to one of the biggest ironies, I believe, of this early chapter of the Trump era. He's a president consumed with the media, with talk shows, with front pages, with columnists, and of course with tweets. At the same time, one of his favorite pastimes, as we know, is attacking the press. His savvy and his disdain are not mutually exclusive. I believe they're inextricably linked. But there's little question that discrediting the media, the Fourth Estate, and many of our institutions is a strategy. The president, as we've seen, loves taking on an enemy. Since he won the campaign and doesn't have one right now, the press has become one, and in some respects, it's become an all too easy one. At a rally this summer in Phoenix, as Mike was mentioning earlier, he called journalists liars, sick people who were trying to take away our history and our heritage. He went on to say, "I really think they don't like our country. I really believe that." Actually, I'm not sure if Trump believes that or not, but I certainly know he wants his base of supporters to. And I often wonder, though, are we playing directly into his hand? By chasing these shiny objects, are we helping him change the subject from the dysfunction that is unmistakably overtaking Washington? I think one of the wisest journalists in town in Washington is Chris Wallace. He's the host of Fox News Sunday, who covered the Reagan administration for NBC and every president since. He spoke out very forcefully earlier this year after Trump first labeled the press the enemy of the American people. "Look, we're big boys. We criticize presidents," Wallace said. "They want us to criticize. If they want to criticize us back, that's fine. But when he said the fake news media is not my enemy, it's the enemy of the American people, I believe that crosses an important line." Now, Wallace was making these comments on Fox and Friends, a morning talk show the president has called one of his favorites. Yet he didn't hold back despite that venue on why he believes this kind of language is so dangerous. He went on to say this, "I know there are a lot of Fox News listeners out there who are going to reflexively take Donald Trump's side on this, but it's a different thing when it's a president. Because if it's a president you like trying to talk about the press being the enemy of the American people, then there's also going to be a president you don't like saying the exact same thing, and that is very dangerous." We've heard President Trump call the New York Times failing, but he also then invites reporters into the Oval Office for interviews. In fact, he has done more interviews with the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and others, more than any other president at this stage. In fact, more than President Obama did the entire time, his entire 8 years. And I wonder, is he seeking validation, or is it manipulation, or is it both? But it was a headline in the New York Times earlier this year, where, as you've heard, I've spent more than 7 years as a reporter, that crystallized why this moment, I believe, is different. The headline said this: "In Watergate, there was one set of facts. In Trump era, take your pick." And my friend Jim Rutenberg, who is the newspaper's chief media writer and was my partner on the 2012 campaign, he made this smart observation about how the media landscape has changed from President Nixon's time in the White House. He said this, he said, "Watergate unfolded in a much simpler time in the media industry. There were 3 major news networks, PBS, a major newspaper or 2 in every city, and a political dynamic in which the leaders duked it out by day and dined together at night. They did so," he went on to say, "on a solid foundation of agreed upon facts, a sense of right and wrong that was shared if not always followed. The Trump-Russia scandal is breaking during a time of informational chaos, when rival versions of reality are fighting for narrative supremacy." He summed it up well, I think, and indeed we don't often agree on facts anymore. If Watergate happened today, if the break-in happened today, I do wonder if people would actually agree that a break-in occurred at the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. Or would the chief of police in Washington be dismissed by the right for being a Democrat or by the left for being a Republican? These days, there's real news that's actually false and false news that people believe is real. It's created such a crazy blur between fact and fiction, it's often hard to find your way out. But that's, I believe, where we come in, and that's our responsibility. 45 years ago, at the age of Watergate, the media landscape today would have been unimaginable. I know I'm showing my age here, especially to the students over here, but I still remember waiting in line in the student union across from Burger King, where Runza now is, and to use one of the few computers with email access. There were just a handful. But today, of course, social media sites like Facebook and Twitter have undoubtedly fostered a sense of community. But increasingly, isn't it a deeply divided community, reinforcing existing beliefs more than actually forming new ones, or certainly a conversation? Social media, I believe, has in fact done one thing above all. It's unified people in their divisions. This, of course, brings us to fake news, perhaps two of the president's favorite words: tweeting, talking, you name it. As we know, the man who brought us The Apprentice and the Art of the Deal is incredibly talented at branding. It's one of his best skills. Make America Great Again was a brilliant brand. He has also an innate ability to tap into what people are thinking and feeling. But fake news has consequences that are all too real, as the Rich family in Omaha tragically experienced last year. You may remember that Seth Rich was a young Democratic aide and a Creighton University graduate, senselessly murdered on the streets of Washington. His death, though, touched off a spiral of conspiracy theories. It's all now the subject of a lawsuit, with a private detective and a former Fox News contributor suing the network for pushing those conspiracy theories, he says with the help of the White House, to overshadow any speculation about the possible collusion between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin in last year's presidential race. This lawsuit is going to be fascinating to watch as it unfolds. But separately, the president has repeatedly, as we know, called the Russia investigation a hoax. He tweeted that 13 days ago, and many of his supporters undoubtedly believe him. Yet just yesterday, the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee joined with the U.S. Intelligence Committee, all the branches of the intelligence services, to say that's simply not true. They maintain there's no question that Russia was trying to influence the election, even if questions of direct collusion are still yet to be determined. Senator Richard Burr, he's a North Carolina Republican and chairman of this committee, stood alongside his Democratic counterpart, Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, in a show of a pretty rare bipartisanship yesterday in Washington, and he said this: "You cannot walk away from this and believe Russia is not currently trying to create chaos on our electoral process." He went on to warn about the elections of 2018 and 2020 and said something must be done, and that investigation continues. But all of this has created a fog the writers of our First Amendment could hardly have anticipated. Facebook and other companies have agreed to testify in Capitol Hill next month about their role in the 2016 election and the role that their advertisements played. So far, it's clear that a number of Russian-linked Facebook ads specifically targeted Michigan and Wisconsin, and congressional investigators are still trying to learn what role fake news, right there in your Facebook feed actually played in this. Now, the aim of this investigation, we say again and again, and I think this is very important, is not to question the outcome of last year's campaign. Senators on both sides are insistent of that. We can have a whole separate conversation about what the Clinton campaign did wrong. I spent most of last year with them, and that would take a separate conversation. Visiting Wisconsin is one. Anyway, but rather than, we knew actually, just a brief aside here, we knew something was wrong. Wisconsin's such a great state to visit, even though we're playing them on Saturday, that just never visited once in all of 2016. So we missed out on our favorite spotted cow beer that they have because the Clinton campaign bus never went there. But anyway, back to my remarks. But the aim of this, of course, is not to question the outcome, but it's to prevent Russian influence in future elections. The world, of course, is all watching this very carefully unfold. But I believe where this goes will be one of the most important stories of our time that will go far beyond this administration. This Senate investigation is one of 3 underway in Washington right now. It's one of the leading reasons that maintaining the credibility of the press and government institutions is critically important. Again, we chase many shiny objects these days in this era of alternative facts and artificial dramas and crises. But the outcomes of these investigations, whatever they will be fundamental to our democracy going forward. Now, I was thinking back, in the first weeks of the Trump administration, Chief White House strategist Steve Bannon at the time had unusually strong words for the press, which offered a window into what the West Wing was thinking and presciently now set the table for what's transpired. The media, Bannon said, should be embarrassed and humiliated and keep its mouth shut and listen for a while. He went on to say, the media here is the opposition party. Ironically and intentionally, Bannon made his comments not on his own Breitbart website, which he's now running again, but in the New York Times, where they would be viewed and seen more as credible. He is right about one thing. The media should listen more. I think that is one of my constant takeaways from covering 5 presidential campaigns. Listen more to voters, listen more to voices outside Washington. We can and we must do better on that score, I believe. But Bannon is absolutely wrong about a larger point, that the media is the opposition party. That simply is not our role. When I walk into the White House every day, I don't believe that we're on a wartime footing with this president. I don't believe that at all. I believe that we are simply doing our job as the First Amendment allows and democracy requires. An old editor of mine back at the Des Moines Register often reminded us that it was not a reporter's job to win a popularity contest. These days, that's a good thing because we certainly aren't, and that's okay. But doing our jobs does not mean we keep our mouths shut, as Bannon suggested. I think one of the wisest newspaper editors of our time right now is the Washington Post, Marty Barron, and he put this in a slightly larger context this year. He said, the founders of this country did not embrace a free press with the notion that it should shut up or be shut down. They maintained just the opposite, that a press would speak up, and that in speaking up would contribute to the self-governance of our republic. Now, the press hardly has a monopoly on the First Amendment, as Mike was talking about earlier. It provides free speech for all, as I was often reminded at Trump rallies where chants of CNN sucks rang through the air. And that is indeed free speech. But the 5 freedoms outlined in those 45 words in the First Amendment, religion, speech, press, assembly, and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances are and should be essential to all of us. In the first 258 days of the Trump presidency, the headlines, as you've seen, have come fast and furiously. On many days, Washington, it seems, is in a state of whiplash, and that's just among the Republicans who are controlling the House, Senate, and the White House for the first time in a decade. There's been a lot of motion, a lot of commotion, but as you've seen, not as much legislative action or results. But there's been no shortage of drama. Administrations have staff shakeups, all of them do. Trump's has already experienced nearly as much as most do in an entire first term. I was reminded of that yesterday morning as I was rushing to the White House after learning that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was holding a hastily arranged news conference at the State Department. He was going to respond, he said, to an NBC News report that he referred to the president as a moron during a meeting earlier this summer at the Pentagon. So Secretary Tillerson calls this rare news conference at the State Department, he hardly ever talks to the press, to insist that he is not considering resigning, but asked directly by a reporter there if he had in fact used the term moron to talk about the president. Tillerson simply said this, "I'm not going to deal with petty stuff like that." In Washington speak, that could be translated into a yes, but we'll leave it at that. But Trump, of course, blasted it as fake news, and he said he has confidence in his Secretary of State. I have a feeling we have not heard the last of this back and forth yet. But there has been a flurry of headlines like this again and again since January. There's been the firing of FBI Director James Comey, National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer, Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci, and those are just the ones that make the headlines. And just last week, Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price, as you probably read, resigned for using $400,000 of taxpayer dollars on a private charter flight. This came only hours after the president referred to him, as a question I asked him on the South Lawn of the White House, as a very fine man. Once again, confirming those words, a very fine man, especially if used on a Friday afternoon, are the kiss of death. He resigned shortly after that. But all of these developments have created this air of dysfunction that the press is not creating. We're simply scrambling to try and stay on top of. Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee, the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was very blunt in his words yesterday. He said, quote, "I think Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Mattis, the Defense Secretary, and Chief of Staff John Kelly are those people that help separate our country from chaos, and I support them very much. Asked today by my colleague Manu Raju on Capitol Hill if he stood by those, he said, by every word of those. Senator Corker announced last week he's not running for re-election, which often is something akin to truth serum in Washington, and increasingly people are speaking out. But I think far more important than any of this, the real test for any president, as you know, and administration comes from events beyond their control. If it was President Bush's response to 9/11 during his early months in office, I just moved to Washington a month before that, and I remember those days so well. And later the reaction to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, or if it was President Obama's handling of the economic collapse, these external events outside the White House shaped their presidencies. We still don't know yet what President Trump's most consequential trial will be. The devastation, of course, caused by the hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Marie have challenged his administration, but it's clear the humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico is an ongoing test. He gave himself, as you know, an A+ for his handling of the storm, insisting any criticism from the 3 million Americans living on the island was fake news. And just yesterday, of course, he visited Las Vegas, where he sadly stepped into the role that has become far too familiar for all of our presidents in the aftermath of another a senseless act of violence. But because of things like the hurricanes and the shootings, the country needs a vigorous and a credible free press. One of our jobs, I think, perhaps the most important part of our jobs, is to cut through the noise and to help our readers and our viewers see through this fog. Do we always get it right? Absolutely not. But Carl Bernstein, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who, of course, broke the Watergate story, describes daily journalism like this, and I've always remembered this. I think it's brilliant. He said it's the best obtainable version of the truth. And that's about right, the best attainable version of the truth. Bernstein also talks about the cauldron of outrage in today's culture. In closing, I think we could all do well with a lot less outrage from all sides, perhaps from the press as well. The challenges facing the country are far too important, from North Korea to Iran to ISIS, you name it. But finally, I'm going to do what I said earlier I would do. I'm going to listen, and I would be happy to take any of your questions about this very important time in our history. But thank you very much for having me at the Peter Hoagland Lecture. Thank you very much.
Well, as you might imagine, I undertake this task with more than a little bit of trepidation. Interviewing Jeff Zeleny is not a task for the faint-hearted. So I would urge members of the audience to write those questions, have a little pity on us, make them as legible as possible, and get those questions up to me as quick as possible. But in the meantime, Jeff, I guess I'll indulge my own interests. One of the things
Are we on or off the record? I'm just kidding.
No, whatever you say in this room, Jeff, stays here. We're all Huskers here. So I was going to start out by asking if you still play trumpet, but you're probably too busy to keep up with your brass instrument these days. One of the things that you talked about was a concern about a presidential administration effectively undermining the press. One of the things that I'd like to get your thoughts on is the press undermining the press, because there seems to be quite a bit of this going on these days. And just to give you a specific example, as you probably are well aware, there was a little bit of a brouhaha that occurred after a segment where you mentioned, in the wake of the Las Vegas shooting, that fans of country and western music tended to be Trump supporters. And then Breitbart wrote something about it, saying that this indicates that Jeff Zeleny and CNN are biased against the Trump administration, and Fox kind of ran with it and even got to the point where they were talking about CNN, helping to precipitate these sorts of things, which is perhaps not so unexpected, but Eric Wemple, the media critic for the Washington Post, watched the same segment and accused you of fawning over Donald Trump and saying that his speech was pitch perfect. And I just want to push you. I mean, what do you do with that? Because
that was an interesting Monday morning because literally, so when you see us at the White House, we're like literally standing on the north lawn of the White House. We have a very little cubicle inside where all of the networks and reporters work, but mainly when we're on television, we're outside. So by the time I got back to my desk, I realized that I had touched off a firestorm on the right and the left, and it was all before lunchtime. And the one about and we were talking before and after the president was giving his address from the diplomatic reception room. And I was criticized by a Think Progress blog and Eric Wemple, I guess I didn't even see that one. For John King, my colleague at CNN, and I were on together, and we were criticized for, fawning over him. And we said it was a presidential speech, it was unifying, and it was all of those things. I stand by every word that I said. I think it was a very pitch-perfect speech. Now some people may say, well, if you can't give a speech like that, but that's a hard moment. And, I think we can't have outrage at every moment. You have to call things like you see them. The criticism on the right, which persisted for several days, which completely conflated and took all of our words out of context about how that country western fans were more likely to be Republicans. In fact, the reason I had that in the back of my mind when we're talking on live television, I remember doing a story during the Trump campaign about how they were advertising on country stations. And in fact, market research will show that a majority of country fans lean Republican. But the point we were making was, I said, this is a shooting that touches the tapestry of all of our lives. We were talking about the Pulse nightclub shooting that happened last year. And I'm presuming, of course, these are just extrapolations. We don't know the political leanings of everyone, and it doesn't matter in this context. But the shooting at the Pulse nightclub, and then the shooting at the country concert, I said this touches the tapestry of all of our lives, and it will be part of our policy debate to come. But this outrage from the left and the right. It used to just be like one channel. Now it is, multiple blogs, and they're driving traffic and other things. I think that it's just noise that we cannot get caught up in because it is really besides the point. I mean, the reality here is there will be a policy debate. In fact, there has been already a policy debate about, with the NRA and Republicans in Washington showing movement, and the Trump administration saying that they will look at the specific type of weapon that this guy had. So anyway, I think all of it is noise, and we try and tune out the noise as much as we can. But both sides are to blame. I mean, to say that one side is to blame over the other, I think, is misstating the fact.
Actually, that leads into one more of my own questions that I'm going to ask. When you were breaking into the business, it was a very different environment in the sense that there was a limited set of news networks, there were some major newspapers, and with the rise of communications technology over the past 20 years, certainly the course of your career, you see all sorts of new media outlets presenting themselves as news media outlets, and everything from Breitbart, Vox, 538, and these spin all the way down to sites that are little more than propaganda. Where do you draw the line? I mean, what is a real news media? I mean, does the First Amendment simply mean anyone can throw up a website and I have just as much right and just as much credibility to tell a story as Jeff Zeleny on CNN? Sure.
I mean, it's free speech, I think, but it is incumbent on the hosts of these, the internet companies and whatnot who host these sites to, police them in some regards. I mean, the whole idea of fake news during the presidential campaign, this is a longer discussion, but, Facebook is doing a lot of soul searching and wrestling now because they are Mark Zuckerberg is the most important publisher in the world. He is Arthur Sulzberger times, a million. And I think that it is incumbent on not to control ideology, but to control, the absolute propaganda and fake news. There were fake news stories that ballots were being stolen on this side and things on that side. It just isn't, but companies were advertising on those. It's all automated, et cetera. But I do think there are questions, as I said, that we could have never imagined, not that long ago, and certainly at the point of the First Amendment. So I would just, as news consumers, find you have more information at your fingertips now than anyone has ever had before. You can research anything you'd like to. You can tell what's a fake or not, but it's not for me to say that some of these blogs shouldn't exist. But I do think that the mainstream media, which I include conservative media in that as well, the Weekly Standard, Fox News, other things. Like I said, Chris Wallace is I think the best, or certainly one of the best journalists of our time. You just have, as consumers, I think you have to be smart about what news you consume.
That makes a good segue into the first question from the audience, which is, should social media be held to the same standards as newspapers and television news? And there's also sort of like a follow-up question to that. Why isn't Fox News held to the same standard?
Sure. In my view, like social media from reputable news outlets should be held to the same standard, but anyone can be a publisher now. Anyone with a phone can write anything that they want. So it's no different than times of writing a letter to the editor. It's just more people see it. I mean, this is, we're not on a new age of people suddenly having opinions about things. It is just, that one person can have a very loud voice. And in some respects, that's very good. It flattens out the hierarchy of things, but I don't think that we've yet sort of wrestled with how you get accurate and a perspective that is necessary in a time like this, because people increasingly obviously are just going to their own channels as opposed to trying to learn something else. But in terms of controlling social media, the cat's out of the bag. I think that's totally on the voter and the consumer to be smart about what you believe and what you listen to.
But does that put pressure on you to, I don't want to say lower your standards, but just put pressure on standards in journalism generally? Because institutions such as CNN, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they're staffed by professional journalists. They have editors, they have fact checkers, they have a legal team making sure that they're not saying anything that's going to get them sued. Anyone can throw up a website and say anything. Mm-hmm. And I mean, certainly there should be some difference there in terms of judgment in the quality of content. But if you've got one of these news sites that's drawing traffic, I mean, does that put pressure on these other institutions to get clicks too?
Sure. I mean, in some respects, I mean, all news organizations are interested in revenue and getting clicks. And this is hardly new to this era. I mean, there was a time when you would, on page 3 of some newspapers, you would have, and certainly in Great Britain, you would have, pictures of naked women on
I never looked at those, Jeff.
No, I'm sure not. Just read for the articles. But I mean, this isn't a new phenomenon. It's just so people have always chased clicks and readers, but I do think that there are different standards. Professional news organizations have standards, again, on the right and the left, and many are in the middle, whether people believe it or not. And the others, we sort of just can't worry about it. I think the marketplace will take care of that. I put, we don't chase things simply like if a random site says that so-and-so is resigning, we don't go with that. I mean, you still have to have your own standards. And in fact, our standards have tightened more because you can't be wrong in this era. The consequences of being wrong are much more severe. Well,
there's an old saying in journalism, of which I'm sure you're aware, that lawyers appeal their mistakes, doctors bury them, and journalists broadcast them for the whole damn world to see.
No question.
What's the best way to reach people who don't watch news? And what can you do to make people share, quote unquote, real news?
Again, I think that's our democracy is, has a bit of a burden on everyone, on citizens to participate in it. I mean, this is a functional democracy because it's a group project of people. You don't have to read the news, you don't have to watch things, but if you want to be an informed citizen, it certainly is a better, it's a good idea. We make things as engaging as possible and whatnot, but I recognize a lot of people aren't watching what we're doing on television or reading what we're doing. Our biggest audience now on CNN by a mile is this. I mean, people are looking at. It's unbelievable when there's a big news story or something, just the number of traffic that people are consuming news. So in a respect, the Trump era has been very good for the news and information business because people are consuming more news to find out what is going on, the truth is, et cetera. So, but I'm not sure that you can make someone interested in the news.
Well, that's an interesting setup for the next question is what can and what should readers do to combat fake news and misinformation? In other words, what can the consumer do?
One thing on Facebook, if you see something that sounds like it's probably not true, or if it's from like a publication you've never heard of, or that's just slightly off, don't share it on your Facebook feed. I was always like so amazed at just friends of mine sharing stories that were clearly not true. And everyone's like, oh, fake news. You know how easy and fun it would be to actually write fake news? To like sit in your pajamas at home and write fake news? I mean, you could be a bit like a fiction writer. It'd be so great. It's much easier much harder doing the real thing. We have to travel all over and like get yelled at and whatever. It'd be much easier to write fake news. But I think that the reporters who get into this business, it's because you want to, ask questions of your leaders and see things in real time. But I think what people can do is be a little bit more discerning. And I think, but more than that, and Facebook has put some controls on, and they will still more. But even the other day of the Las Vegas shooting, the two top trending stories for a while were from a Russia propaganda sites about the shooting. So the questions are very, very real ones for Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg and others. Have they created a machine that they can't control? It's a real question that I don't have an easy answer to, but it's something that will also define our time.
Do you think they've ducked a little bit of responsibility? Because I mean, Zuckerberg has kind of come around a little bit, but he clearly has been pushed into that.
He's definitely been pushed into it. 8 months ago after the election, he basically said, we had no fake news, we were not involved in any of this. And now they'll be testifying before Congress, I think the first week of November. Yeah, of course I think they have a responsibility, because like it or not, he's the most powerful publisher in the world.
Do you believe that there is a desensitization to the news, and is that dangerous?
I do, and I do think it's dangerous. Things move so quickly, and there's so much, and we certainly don't help it by every moment there's like breaking news. I mean, I don't blame people for wanting to turn off their TV at some point, but yeah, I think people are desensitized, and this has become normal. I think if it's to shootings or if it's to anything, we become desensitized to things, the more they happen. And I think that's very dangerous.
How do you avoid burning out, given the rate at which news happens these days?
I mean, it's so exciting. How could you burn out? There's so much more. I mean, we don't know how the movie's going to end, right? So that's one way to keep from burnout. But in all seriousness, I do have to say it takes a village to cover any White House, but this White House in particular that is really churning a lot of things. And we have a team of about 15 people or so covering the White House, about 5 correspondents on air, and then a big support staff. So thankfully, I'm not responsible alone for keeping my eye on this and everything else. We have a team, but I think you just have balance in your life, and you have to be interested in this. But it's why I would hate and to the students for a second, I would hate for anyone to have a sort of cynical view of public service. I think it's more important than ever before. The young Hill staffers I see, the young White House staffers I see, if you're interested in this, it's the best job in the world. I mean, like, where can you have such an eye on history unfolding in real time? So I talk to students who want to be journalists. They're like, oh, there aren't as many jobs now. There are in fact more jobs than ever before because there are so many different outlets and other things. So I hope that none of this is discouraging from people who would otherwise think about a job in public service. I think the opposite is true, that it demands more smart, good people.
Well, I think I and Maria, the Dean of Journalism, really appreciate that, because we probably got a few more journalism and political science majors out of that, so we really appreciate that.
That was a double major.
Yeah, so, and I'm aware of that, right. So yeah.
It took me 5.5 years. Don't look at my transcript.
Why, what's there? That sounds
I don't know, I'm not sure.
What would you say to those who claim that the press is divisive and that we need to present a united front to the rest of the world?
I would say that they should listen to Professor Fenner's speech. And it's not about presenting a united front or agreeing with the leader. It's not about saying that everything is doing well and everything is perfect. That's not what the founders intended. That's not what this democracy was founded on. So, but I think there are lines. I mean, you don't pick argument for argument's sake. Like the day of the president's speech, he talked for 5 minutes in the diplomatic reception room, talked about the tragedy. It was perfectly presidential, and if some people on the left had seen President Obama give that exact same speech, the exact same speech in the teleprompter, which they both use, they'd be like, oh, brilliant. I think we have to cool it a little bit. I mean, the whole idea that that you'd be attacked or criticized for praising something, I think is very emblematic of that. But look, I think the press plays a huge role in this. The press is, incredibly divisive in some respects. I would argue, and I'm sure some people disagree with this, but CNN, plays it down the middle. We have about pretty much an even split of viewers of partisanship, a little bit a more liberal independent, I think like 60% and maybe like 40% Republicans, but look for an outlet that is, that tries to play it down the middle, or look at several of them. I think the divisive outlets that are, simply putting forward an agenda, I think that has a pretty short shelf life.
Why do you think President Trump picks fights with outlets like CNN and the New York Times and not outlets like Msnbc, which arguably, at least from some perspectives, could be claimed to be leaning more to the left?
Actually, yesterday, NBC broke the moron story, Moron Gate, and he tweeted yesterday as he was going to Las Vegas that that NBC now is the leader in fake news, or something like that. So I think that it's because of his obsession. President Trump's really is consumed by the New York Times. He's a product of New York. He's lived there his entire life. He wants the validation of the New York Times, and it's fascinating. And I think CNN is an easy target to hit. He watches it, and CNN sucks. I guess sounds better at his rallies than NBC or something. Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue as well. It's too confusing.
What do you think are the biggest challenges facing the press going into the future?
I think the biggest challenges are just, keeping that navigation signal straight ahead through this fog and noise and not being distracted by shiny objects. And when I say shiny objects, we talk about that a lot. If a tweet is a shiny object or not, like where does it fall on the spectrum? And, and there's a lot of disagreement over that. Like, was the whole issue over the NFL and if players should stand or kneel, was that a shiny object or a serious debate? It, in my view, was a serious debate, but there was a big debate inside a lot of news organizations, I think, how much time to spend to that, because there was no question the president was changing the subject over a very bad week of healthcare collapsing, the top Republican priority for years, collapsed again, North Korea, other things. So he is very good, and I say this complimentary, and he's very good at tapping into something that the majority of people believe in. But in terms of what the press should do, I think be very careful, walk a fine line of those shiny objects, and keep the navigation signal on what's important. And I also think the Bob Schieffer, who is a legend and a compass, I think, of good judgment and whatnot, the retired CBS newsman. He's out with a new book, and he's been on a few shows. And he, is basically, I think the book is how to tune out the noise or how to navigate the noise or something. And he makes some very good points in that for the press. For the press also not to become, combative or whatnot. I believe that very seriously. We are not the opposition. If that's a role that the president and the administration wants the press to play, that's their business. But I do think the media has to be very careful not falling into that combative trap. Not saying you pull your punches or you don't ask tough questions, you do. But they do not get to make the rules of what our role is. We know what our role is. History defines the role. And it's the role we'll do our jobs.
You know, you use the term bright, shiny objects. I mean, there's other bright, shiny objects in other presidential administrations, but is the Trump administration significantly different in the sense that it's harder for journalists to sustain a focus on a story? Because, you know, some of these things don't break in a convenient way to fit within the 24-hour news cycle. Some of them require a sustained focus over days, weeks, or months. And is that harder during the Trump administration?
I think it's harder because there are more things. Like, some days there are 6 things at once, and like, what do you pay attention to? But again, some of that is by design.
This is a good question. I'm very interested to hear your answer to this. What's your advice to aspiring journalists?
My advice to aspiring journalists is learn how to write, regardless of what medium you're going into. Learn how to write. I'm amazed at, I think the ability to write is the most important thing you do. If you end up going to law school or whatever, it will set you above. And I also think it is, if you are curious, if you are interested in that, absolutely chart a path and do it. I kind of had a traditional route. My first byline was at my weekly newspaper, the Fillmore County News in Exeter, Nebraska, from a really small town. Then I did sports at the York News Times, and then I just wanted to be a journalist since I was a very little kid. Everyone is not like that, and that's good. I think that, but just get experience any place you can get experience. It doesn't have to be. I didn't start at the New York Times. I started at the York News Times. And I was so sort of ashamed. Now I love telling that story, but I was going in for my interview at the New York Times in 2006 in New York, and I thought, should I bring that up? Like, hey, we're at the York News Times. I'm like, oh no, they'll not think that's funny. But after I was there for 7 years in my departure speech, I really got a lot of mileage out of that, because I thought that's great. But you should definitely just get experience any place you can get experience. Internships, writing, working, and read a lot. Read a lot. Find a writer that you identify with, or a couple, or someone on TV or something. Watch what they do, study them, stalk them, within the means of the law.
What is your personal opinion of President Trump's direct contact to people via Twitter? And do you think that directness is a pro or a con?
I think the fact that he uses Twitter, I don't think that that's a con at all. I think that's just a technology that is available to him. It gives a lot of his aides heartburn. His new chief of staff, or somewhat new chief of staff, John Kelly, he was talking to a few of us a couple weeks ago, and he said, sometimes you see the tweets the same time I do. I'm like, wow, that's kind of a high wire act. But I think that reaching out to people and communicating directly, I don't think that is the problem. I think it's more of the unusual substance of calling on Congress to investigate the Fourth Estate. But I think using Twitter directly, it's just a new type of technology. I will say, when he mentions you, your followers really shoot through the roof.
I do think Kelly's blood pressure went up when Twitter announced it was considering going to
200. 280,
yeah,
I know,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
We still don't know if the president, though, is on that sample. They're picking certain people that can have the expanded platforms.
How do you feel about the corporatization of news, and what the audience members asking here, corporations owning a lot of media outlets, so there's a lot of power being concentrated in a few corporate hands?
Sure. I mean, I think in a perfect world, people would love a successful, rich local person to own your newspaper or television station or radio station or what have you, but that is not always the case. I think the most recent example, the Washington Post, was essentially on the verge of bankruptcy and being defunct. The Graham family had it for years and years, and when Jeff Bezos from Amazon rescued it, a lot of journalists there were sort of aghast that Amazon's buying us. You cannot find any unhappy person there now because they've hired a few hundred more people. It is it's a whole different place. So I think in one respect, I mean, it's nothing that's ideal, but it is just the consolidation of everything. So I think it's nothing that we can sort of spend time fretting over. It also is expensive to cover the news. To cover the news, to have a bureau in Afghanistan and in Iraq and other places is an expensive proposition. When I was at the New York Times during the Iraq War, that this was kind of genius. The editor was looking for money to staff the a rack bureau. So they added like 6 more fashion magazines, and they called them T-Style at the time, to make, you know, those glossy things, and it made money for the newspaper to pay specifically for the Baghdad bureau. So it's business. It is a you know, we're not involved in the business side, but I'm glad the business side is there. Otherwise, you know, you wouldn't be able to do your job.
This is a question that I'm interested in, is how did your work as a newspaper journalist prepare you for CNN? And one of the things, just to kind of like follow up on that, is what are the big differences that you see in the pros and cons of working in the print world versus working in the television world?
The differences are fewer than they used to be, because now virtually everyone is on every platform. Look on virtually any television screen on MSNBC, CNN, Fox. You'll see newspaper reporters there. And that's actually how I got my start doing TV. I was doing a lot of appearances on Sunday shows and other things. You know, now every newspaper has a video department, so there really are not as many differences as they used to be. But I'll tell you, I would say the biggest difference is on live television, as you said earlier, there is no copy desk to save you. There is no editor to save you. You have to think of your words carefully, and I think you have to be able to think quickly. I believe it's prepared me well, just because I've been in Washington for a while. I've covered campaigns. I've covered other White Houses. So I think that in this era, it's really hard to talk about like the differences between. There are more differences between the old newspaper days and the existing newspaper days than there are between newspapers of this moment and TV. The reality is everyone is filing constantly. The internet has. There's some older reporters who lament the idea that the internet ruined the 3-martini lunch. Because you are constantly on deadline as a newspaper reporter. You're never able to just wait and file your story at night. So the differences are not that many. And sure, there are some cosmetic aspects of being on television and other things. You have to put video to it. I find it still to be a great challenge. And we also write a lot at CNN.com and on digital. I mean, CNN mainly now, again for students, most of their new hires in the last 2 years have been people with a print background or a newspaper background or writing background than a TV background.
Well, I'm sad to hear of the demise of the 3-martini lunch, but it confirms my decision to get out of journalism.
Right. Wise one. Yeah.
This next question presumes that the press has lost its credibility, but the question is will the press be able to regain credibility during the Trump presidency?
It's a great question. I think that's in the eye of the beholder. But I was looking at a piece of research that I think Reuters Ipsos had this public survey of 15,000 Americans, which is a big sample, as you know, for a poll. And the percentage of people's trust in the media has gone up about 10 points from earlier this year in February. So some people are turning toward the media more to be a referee and sort of a tour guide, if you will, through all this. But there's no question our trust and credibility is eroded. Again, some of that's the media's fault, no question, but a lot of it is a systematic effort to discredit the media for a reason.
This next question kind of ties into the bright, shiny objects and it being hard to sustain focus on a story. But when is the press going to get and expose Trump's tax returns?
Well, I haven't, no. I mean, that's nothing that the press can do, right? I mean, the voters clearly made a decision that they didn't care about his tax returns. He was the first candidate, since the Watergate era to not release his tax returns. People didn't mind, so the press certainly hammered him on it. If anyone will get the tax returns, that's something that could come through an investigation. Is that a part of the special counsel's investigation? Is that why Bob Mueller has a team of tax investigators on his team? It might be. We don't know, but I mean, that's nothing that the press can do.
What are your views on satirical news outlets? And I'm assuming that the question here is referring to like John Oliver and The Daily Show. And do you think that they are important to the general population's understanding of what happens in Washington?
I think any type of informing the public is better than nothing. I mean, The Daily Show does a very, very good job with a point of view. I mean, it's just like reading a column or an editorial, but it's certainly informative. I wouldn't recommend satire or The Daily Show as your only source of information, but it's better than not knowing anything, I guess. But a lot of stuff is very funny, but I think that we're seeing right now, Jimmy Kimmel, for example, he's a comedian and an entertainment host on ABC, but he has been in the center of the healthcare debate in an interesting way, in ways that we haven't really seen. So, it is just another example of how, no one has ownership, or, the three channels are gone. Everyone has a voice, and I think it's fine, as long as you know what it is. I mean, I wouldn't tune into him for an impartial view, because he comes at this with a point of view. And The Onion you should just read for fun, because it's funny.
What is your response to the assumption or accusation that CNN is a liberal news network?
It's funny because they're like, oh, Clinton News Network. It's funny, at Trump rallies they would say CNN Clinton News Network. At Clinton rallies they would say TNT, Trump News Television. All you do is cover Trump. And there's some truth to that as well. We were just criticized and hammered last year for airing so many of then candidate Trump's speeches live. And our leadership at CNN has said, an after-action report on that, they probably wouldn't have aired so many of his speeches live in their entirety, because they weren't doing that for other Republican candidates. I think if you think CNN's a liberal news organization, certainly there are liberal points of view on there, but I think as a whole, if you look at it in today's landscape of things, with MSNBC being on the left, et cetera, it doesn't match reality that it's liberal. Now, are there, is there too much outrage sometimes about certain things in the president? Do some of our hosts or the opinion people sort of go overboard? Sure. But I think in the whole scheme of things, what the news reporters are doing on it is pretty much straight news.
Jeff, you've been a terrific sport, and this is the last question.
Uh-oh. The last one always gets you.
I've been searching for that last question frantically. Have you ever had any conflicts with your personal reporting and your network's policies on news?
I have not. CNN, I actually was surprised when I started there. I just thought, just as a viewer there, their news standards might not be as high. They're much higher than any place I've ever worked. Things are vetted in triplicate by lawyers, by other things, and because they've been burned and had mistakes over the years with the Boston bombing, for example. That was just kind of a black eye. They identified the victims or the suspects as other people. They, have had some other missteps, as a lot of news organizations have. With NBC and the exploding trucks, it just sort of, the New York Times and the weapons of mass destruction. I mean, you could do a long list of media misfires, but no, there are no directives from the top of point of view or other things. It is just get the story. And believe it or not, most reporters and journalists simply like the story. And if I wanted to be an opinion columnist or an opinion person, there's certainly a million outlets. And again, it would be easier, but I just think it's more interesting to try and do an even job, a fair job on both sides. So we do not have any directives from the top except to get the story. And often these days, we spend as much time trying to not get stories that are wrong. You'll see blog posts saying that someone is, how many times has, Reince Priebus, the White House Chief of Staff, was going to leave by Memorial Day, was going to be fired by Flag Day, was going to be out on the 4th of July. So we spend a lot of time kind of putting the brakes on false reports. But no, we have no directives from the top. My judgments, my standards, my ethics have never been at odds with CNN.
Well, thanks, Jeff. We truly appreciate
Thank you very much.
Such a professional.
Thank you guys. I appreciate it.
I have one last duty to perform, and that is to introduce the person who's going to give our closing remarks, Brian Hastings. He's the president and CEO of the University of Nebraska Foundation, the organization that's done so much to put this on tonight. So, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And let me begin by thanking each and every one of you for being with us tonight to attend the Peter J. Hoagland lecture this evening. We hope you'll join us next year and every year. As Chancellor Green mentioned, this rotates every year, so we'll be at UNO next year, and we hope to have you join us. I want to thank Barbara and the members of the Hoagland family who are with us. Can we give them a round of applause? Good evening. And I think it's appropriate in doing that and recognizing Peter's legacy to ask, can we have the public servants who are with us, past and present office holders, to stand and be recognized, and thank you for your public service. A very special thanks to Jim and Patsy Crounce for your support to make this lecture possible. One of the great joys of the work that we do at the Foundation is we get a chance to work with people who want to make a difference in this university, in the lives of students and the lives of faculty and the programs. And this is a great example of how private support can enhance and enrich the experience of a university. And so we're so grateful, Jim and Patsy, for your support to make this possible. At this time, I do want to invite Jeff Zeleny and Mike Fenner back up to please come back up to the stage. We have a little something for you. Jeff, we can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your, I can't imagine, crazy schedule. We talk about how busy things are. Your world has just got to be nuts. And
I heard there was a game on Saturday.
There is a game on Saturday, but we so appreciate you sharing your talent and your expertise with us, and you make your alma mater very proud.
Thank you.
And to Professor Fenner, we want to thank you for being with us tonight, being part of the program, and sharing your expertise with us and joining us from Omaha. Thank you very much. So this concludes our 2017 Hoagland Lecture. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great night, and go Big Red.